Before I begin this video, I have to say thank you to the subscribers to my channel. We just hit 50. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a big deal to me. Thank you everyone, especially my lovely grandmother. There she is. Couldn't do this without you. The hood's down. Dahmer. Let's talk about it. Dahmer is the semi-fictional account of Jeffrey Dahmer, told largely from the perspectives of his victims. The series stars Evan Peters as the main character, but also features the likes of Niecy Nash, Molly Ringwald, and Richard Jenkins as Dahmer's father, Lionel Dahmer. There's also a bevy of supporting cast members, far too many to list here. However, I would say pay special attention to the actors who play the victims. They give ridiculously good performances. They're so believable in what I would imagine is the most demanding role in the entire show. Except for one, of course, and that is Evan Peters playing Jeffrey Dahmer. The show follows the time from when Dahmer was a child all the way up to his death in 1994. It is a harrowing and unflinching portrait of one of this country's most prolific and horrible serial killers, but also a very interesting one. Dahmer wasn't particularly remorseful for what he did, but he was very much able to acknowledge that what he did was wrong. What he did was horrible and that he was sick. He was sorry for it, as much as he was able to be sorry. Very honest about everything. You know, basically from the moment he was caught, he didn't put up a struggle, he didn't fight. There's a great scene in the show where where Evan Peters as Dahmer is talking about the fact that he feels different than other serial killers because he actually confessed to his crimes. He tries to make peace with them. He did apologize for whatever it was worth, but he did. A lot of serial killers don't do that. We'll forget about that. Just because we know what happened doesn't mean that the families have ever gotten that peace because they were never admitted to, or some of those people were such cowards that after what they did, they still couldn't do the smallest thing which would have had the biggest impact for someone else. For people who study psychopathy and all these personality disorders, in the context of mental illness, yes, he was very sick, but he still knew right from wrong. So it's almost like he was addicted to it. You're going to see parallels between addiction and what he did when you watch this show. So it's more complicated than I think most people think it is in that regard. A lot of controversy surrounding the show as well. People have said it's taking advantage of the victims, making money off of them, that it's insulting to their memory to keep making movies about Jeffrey Dahmer. While I can certainly sympathize with that, I think a reason we're seeing the constant resurgence of this certain story is because it hasn't ever been told well. I mean, there's been movies and shows about Jeffrey Dahmer, but I never thought any of them were particularly good. Going into this, I didn't really know what he did. I have myself a morbid fascination with serial killers. You know, Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy and the Night Stalker. I know a fair amount about them as well, and their backgrounds, what they did, their crimes, etc. But for Dahmer, I had no idea really what he was all about. I knew he was a little bit of a cannibal, and I knew that he was into some pretty gross, creepy stuff. So for me, it was a learning experience watching this because a lot of the things that he did are shown in the series and they're pretty much exactly how they happened. I would imagine that's one of the difficulties about making a show or movie about this kind of thing. Constant balancing act of maintaining historical accuracy while keeping it entertaining and interesting and fun to watch. I shouldn't say fun to watch, I just mean entertaining to watch. It's not fun watching people get fucking murdered on screen, but... So the series begins with an introduction of Jeff's apartment. We see immediately his dependency on alcohol and that there's apparently a really strong bad smell coming from his apartment. So bad that his neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, actually confronts him in the hallway in the middle of the night. She's like, "Hey Jeff, your apartment still smells really bad. Can you please fix that?" And he just walks up creepily and gazes at her with this dead stare and he's like, "Oh, my fish died. They had this tropical thing called ick. Yeah. Anyways, I'll take care of it this weekend." Peters, he's got the accent down, he's got the mannerisms down, he's got his walk down. It's terrifying. And I love the reaction from Glenda's character. Like, you can tell she's this no-nonsense, badass woman, but she's still afraid of him. She's still creeped out by him, unsure what he's gonna do. She knows something's wrong with him, she just doesn't know exactly what that is. I thought the woman who played Glenda did a fantastic job. I think she was amazing. And unlike the more recent interpretations of other actors who play Jeffrey Dahmer, the first one that comes to mind is Ross Lynch in the movie My Friend Dahmer. Ross was playing Jeff as a character. And this, as I said before, Evan Peters is Jeffrey Dahmer. I didn't know much about him before I watched this, but when I started watching and researching interviews, seeing more footage of the real life Jeffrey Dahmer, I was like, oh wow, yeah, that's the guy right there. I have a newfound respect for Evan Peters, even though I already had a lot of respect for him before. Here is his coup de grace. So the first episode actually ends with Dahmer getting captured. There's a tense standoff in his apartment after he picks up a guy from the bar, Tracy Edwards, who was a real person. The actor they got to play him did an amazing job, and he looks just like him. He got away in real life, and he brings the cops back, and they search his apartment. They find all of his serial killer stuff, and they arrest him right there. I didn't know the show was going to go that route, but it makes sense that they would, and I'm glad that they did. Next scene is his dad getting the phone call from the police saying, hey, you need to come, your son's been arrested for something, and we need to tell you in person what it is because it's pretty bad. Again, his name is Lionel Dahmer, and he's played by Richard Jenkins. He starts crying. It's a phenomenal performance because you imagine, as a parent, being told your child has murdered all of these people in this way. They weren't accidents. I just don't understand how that doesn't destroy a person. But hey man, the human spirit's it's an incredible thing. Anyway, so for the most of the show, it's told through flashbacks from the detectives as they're interrogating Jeff. Then at like the 7th or 8th episode, it finally intersects, and then it just takes off as one narrative from there. It can be a little confusing because the show is trying to be told from the perspective of the victims. Now, the show, interestingly enough, tries to paint a picture of a really unstable home life for Jeff. Parents got into huge yelling arguments. There was no physical violence ever. His dad apparently would leave from time to time, and his mom was crazy. And the show tries to make it seem like that's part of the reason he ended up the way he ended up. But by Jeff's own admission, is said many times over and over that his parents had nothing to do with the way he was, and that he knew from like the time he was 10 that something was wrong with him. So I was kind of confused as why the show was hammering home so much on the dysfunction element. Yeah, it's a dysfunctional home life, I guess, but like if that was the benchmark for abuse that would lead to a serial killer, then I feel like a lot of people should be serial killers. So as mentioned before, the show takes place through flashbacks told by Dahmer to the detectives. Chronicles from when Dahmer was a little kid, all the weird shit he did back then, middle school, high school, up until when he was killing folks. One thing that was really surprising about this to me was how much of a life Dahmer lived, if that makes sense. He was in the military, he had several jobs, he went to jail for like a year or two for a lesser crime that was really creepy and weird, but he didn't kill anybody. I remember what it was actually. Well, it's in the show. And a lot of what the show is actually the relationship between him and his dad, which surprised me a lot. He was obviously very close with his father as he was growing up. And once he was convicted of his crimes, his dad actually stayed by his side throughout the entire ordeal, up until he died. And before Jeff was caught and before he was known as a serial killer, he was pretty much screwing up all on his own before he started killing folks. He was kicked out of the military. He got fired from a lot of the jobs that he had. People thought he was weird. He didn't have any friends. He got banned from bathhouses because he was accused of drugging people who went there. So there were all of these red flags that were just popping up all over the place. But there wasn't anything conclusive to arrest him and send him away for the rest of his life or anything. I think that's why people like his neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, were so frustrated. They knew something was wrong with him. They knew that he was a danger to people, but they just didn't have the proof or the ability to get that proof. However, on that note, he was still pretty socially malleable. Like, he was able to convince a lot of men to come back to his apartment of their own free will. If he wasn't able to charm them, then he would just offer them money. But the point remains that he still made people feel comfortable enough that they would come back to his apartment middle of the night after meeting him at a bar. It was just fascinating to see that. And some of the changes that the series made from real life were really small and insignificant. For instance, in the first episode when he lures back Tracy to his apartment, well, in real life, they didn't just go straight back to his apartment. They went to a corner store to get alcohol first. Tracy met up with his brother. The other people that were at the bar, one of them was white. In the series, they're both black. In the series, it's implied that all of them are gay. In real life, Tracy Edwards is straight. He's testified that he's straight in court and that he was only going back to his apartment under the pretense of possibly making some money to pose for photographs. He did know they were possibly going to be nude photos, but he also said that he didn't get the vibe that Jeff was a homosexual either. Interesting that they made little changes like that in the series, and I'm sure they did it just to save time and to simplify everything. That was my point earlier, that I was impressed that they didn't change very many things of what happened in real life. I think that's why so much of the controversy around the show is gaining so much traction, because it is pretty much how it happened. And if you were one of the victims, or the victim's family, or one of the victim's friends, or even if you were close to the case, or even if you're just a regular person, it can be disturbing to have to watch that, or to be subjected, or feel like you're being subjected to having to live through it again. I know that if I was a victim of a situation like this, I don't know how I would respond. I like to think that I'd be okay with it, but I couldn't tell you to a certainty. So the show is 10 episodes long. I can't get into everything that happened in just one video. I wouldn't want to anyway. I think it's important that everyone should go watch this show as soon as possible. If you have any interest in the morbid, or any interest in serial killers or anything like that, Jeffrey Dahmer or any of the others, then I think this series is going to be an easy binge watch for you. If you're not interested in that kind of stuff, then I would say you probably don't want to watch this. Yeah, it's not a show for you. It might not be graphic or gory throughout most of it, but it's a very difficult, uncomfortable thing to watch, because you're going into the psyche of this person who is just so sick and so damaged. It's hard to get through on the other end without feeling some of that yourself. Because while it's not a documentary, I couldn't help but feel like it was a docu-series of some kind. It did happen. Maybe they didn't happen exactly the way they said they did in the show, but they still happened pretty close to the way it showed. Anyways, that's my 2 cents on it. I could go on more and more about this show because it was phenomenal, but if I have to give it a rating, I would give it an 8.4 out of 10. A lot of 8 out of 10s. Whew. If you do think it's controversial and disrespectful to the victim's memories, let me know in the comments. If you don't, let me also know in the comments.